Thank you very much. Thank you, Nora. Thank you for coming to this panel. For the sake of saving time, I will not speak long as introductory remarks. The issues which are burning to the international agenda have been debated lately in quite detail, and I try to contribute, including at the General Assembly of the United Nations. And the English and French text of my statement in New York in September, these texts are available for your convenience. So I would just sum up briefly what we believe is going on. Of course, the world is changing, and this change is going to be a long historical period. And the essence of the change is multipolarity. Today, multilateralism is mentioned as a slogan. We believe that whatever terminology you use, polycentric world, multipolar world, multilateral world, the essence is the same. No single country, no group of countries like what we call the historical West can rule this situation alone. New centers of economic growth, of financial might, and of political influence appear just on our eyes. China, India, Brazil, other Latin American countries, African countries are rising, and soon, historically soon, they will certainly demand more say in the world affairs. So that's why, by the way, the key issues are no longer discussed in G7, and G20 was reinvigorated 9 years ago to give more room for the countries of other regions other than Europe and the United States. And this is a very healthy trend, because the more powerhouses there are, the more sustainable the international situation would look. Of course, our Western friends are not happy because for more than 5 centuries, they dominated the political, economic, and cultural, civilizational life on this planet. They try to put this process, this objective process on brakes, and try to make it more difficult, for this objective reality to happen. One manifestation of this position is the invention of a new concept. Instead of referring, as we had been doing for years, to international law, they call upon everybody to respect rules-based world order. And what it means when it is in the interest of the West. They, for example, declare that right of the peoples to self-determination is sacrosanct. When it does not fit in the interest, they declare this illegitimate. Compare Kosovo and Crimea. Crimea, where referendum was taken, was held, and Kosovo, where no referendum was held, but Kosovo was immediately recognized as an independent state by most of the Western countries. And another example how the rules are being introduced in real life is what is going on with the Organization on Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. There is a convention which prohibits chemical weapons and which created a technical secretariat authorized to respond to requests of member states when they want to find out whether a prohibited substance had been used or not. Period. The secretariat, the technical secretariat, as it is called, has no other function. The Western countries, by a vote, imposed upon the technical secretariat the competence of the Security Council, not only to establish whether a substance had been used or not, but also to establish the guilt, to finger point whom they want to accuse of doing this. And this decision was, it is a radical change of the convention itself. To modify a convention, you need to introduce amendments, you need to negotiate them, and then everybody must ratify them. So this was really a very unfortunate twist in the behavior of the Western countries, who, for the reasons of political feasibility, are violating international law and introduce the rules which they develop themselves. From one case to another case, these rules might differ. In this category, we can see the dismantling of a joint comprehensive plan of action on Iranian nuclear issue. Absolute rebuttal by the United States of all international decisions on Palestine, ignoring everything which was done by the Security Council and became part of international law. And of course, extra territorial application of national legislation and so on and so on and so forth. Our point is that we have to really accept the reality. We cannot ignore the interest of any group of countries, including Western countries, but the West should not try to present itself as a final judge and prosecutor. I think a very healthy discussion should be held and strengthened and supported in G20 format, where G7 is represented, where BRICS is represented, and other developing regions who are not party to the BRICS structure are there. It's a very representative group of countries, and I believe it is not just by chance that more and more G20, which was launched to deal with key financial and economic issues, is more and more addressing political agenda of international community. In a sense, this is to compensate a lack of solution to the Security Council reform. The countries who want to be heard in the world political discussions, they believe that G20 provides a platform where this could be done. But this does not mean that we have to forget about the reform of the Security Council. The key deficiency of the Council is underrepresentation of developing countries. It's only if we increase the representation of Asia, Latin America, and Africa that we can resolve this problem. The increased representation of the West is not going to help. It is not going to give any added value. And I would, draw your attention that in any configuration of the Security Council, the West has at least 1/3 and sometimes more seats. So my appeal is for a debate which would recognize that the triumphantly proclaimed end of history after the demise of the Soviet Union did not take place, that history is very well and alive, and the domination of the West, which was predicted by Francis Fukuyama forever, is not, did not take place. And recognition of this reality is manifest in quite a number of analytical pieces and of recent statements of President Macron and in his interviews. So let's discuss where we are going.
I think you might, yes. But you should have one of your own, I think. Let me just grab the mic. That's mine. Thanks very much. Here we go. So, Minister, thanks very much for a very intriguing, very elaborate statement as always. If I were to summarize your statement, would I be right in saying the West is pretty much to be blamed for everything? No?
No, not for everything, just for its own mistakes.
Okay, let's take it from here. To kick this off, I wanted to start with a question, and this question is about Syria. Now, Russia, for all intents and purposes, has really become one of the key players in the Middle East, not only in Syria. I heard someone say recently that Russia has become the sheriff of the Middle East. Now, to stay in that metaphor, one should probably say that as a sheriff, Russia is also the one to make sure that the city stays a safe place. So with great power comes great responsibility, as we know ever since Superman. So my question to you would be, is your country, is Russia prepared to provide for public goods in the Middle East and in Syria in particular?
Well, this sheriff mentality is the Western invention. Walled policemen. I mean, this logic is not applicable to what we witness in Syria. Don't forget that the Syrian crisis started against the background of huge crimes committed in the Middle East, not by us. Invasion in Iraq, when in 2003 it was announced that democracy had prevailed in the country. Who can remember this episode when George Bush Jr. declared the victory of democracy in Iraq? Look at Iraq, what is going on there now. By the way, just as Al-Qaeda was born after the Americans supported Mujahideen in Afghanistan in 1970s, in the expectation that after the Soviets are out, the Americans would be able to control Mujahideen. Instead, Al-Qaeda was created, which boomeranged against the United States on 9/11 in 2001. By the same token, in Iraq, after the invasion in 2003, a few years later, ISIS was established and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was let out of the American prison, and he became, you know, number one in this terrible caliphate. And the invasion of Libya, aggression against Libya, and later against Syria, gave birth to another manifestation of Al-Qaeda named the Jabhat al-Nusra, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, whatever they call themselves. And the Libyan aggression against Libya created several waves of terrorism into sub-Saharan Africa and of illegal migration into Europe. Those were the results of adventures against Iraq, Libya, and Syria.
Minister,
and when the Syrian government was about to be toppled by ISIS, when the terrorists were at the outskirts of Damascus, and when the president of Syria requested us to help, yes, and I believe we did the right thing, because apart from Idlib and some areas on the eastern bank of the Euphrates River, the terrorists are not in control of this country, and the legitimate government is back in the driver's seat.
So let me ask you this, Minister, to press you a bit further. There are people who say that supporting Assad really pushes the Syrian Sunnis yet even more into the arms of radical forces on the extremist side, Jabhat al-Nusra and others. What's your thinking about that?
Well, we have to deal with what we inherited in Syria after the French left the country, and it was the French design of power sharing in Syria.
Those French.
Well, this is the fact. We never had colonies, you know, and we have to deal with the results of colonial period. You take a look at the borders in Africa and including in the north of Africa, just straight lines cutting across ethnic and religious groups. And next year, by the way, we will be commemorating anniversary of the Declaration of the General Assembly of the United Nations on independence to colonial countries and peoples. And I believe we shall remember how this declaration was adopted and what is still not resolved, because some countries did not receive independence as was required by the General Assembly. And if people now, some say we shall not remember colonial times, we must, you know, live by today. But people, many people, including in Europe, they want to reopen the issues related to the end of World War II, which was 20 years before decolonization. Decolonization is a much younger phenomenon, and to ignore it and to ignore the need to analyze how exactly decolonization takes place and whether this is the end of it, whether the remaining colonial people should remain under their metropolis. It's an open issue. So back to Syria, you know, many Sunnis became part of the system. They are active in business and in administrative life of their country. And I don't believe that all Sunnis just would like to topple the legitimate government and to be embraced by the terrorists. I don't think so.
And no concern that Russia may be seen as a neo-colonial power in the Middle East?
Look, we have been invited, unlike the United States, unlike France, unlike Germany, unlike other members of the so-called anti-terrorist coalition who are present in Syria illegitimately. We have been invited by a legitimate government. I don't believe that this fits into the description of colonialism.
Well, there are different opinions on the legitimacy of the Syrian government, but that aside, ladies and gentlemen, let me open this for your questions, your comments. There are, in the name of the rules-based order, a couple of rules that I wanted to ask you to heed. One is, please say who you are. Secondly, please be as crisp and as concise as you can. And thirdly, you should always remember that a question should end with a question mark. So, Minister, if I understand right, we have like 10 more minutes or so for questions, if that's okay. So please shoot first. Rarita. I think you should, yeah, let me give you my mic. And I'll take.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I'm Rarida Dergham. I'm founder and executive chairman of Beirut Institute. And I was wondering, Mr. Minister, nice to see you again. I was wondering if, how do you view what's happening in Iraq in terms of the revolution or the uprising, however whatever term you use, as well as what's happening in Lebanon? Does Russia support or oppose any of these movements? What is your view of them? Are they healthy for the country, the evolution of the country, or are they not? Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Ragida, you would believe me, only yesterday I was dwelling upon these issues because we got used to being interested in everything which is going on Earth. The Salisbury poisoning, Brexit, Catalonia. Recently, we were mentioned as the ones who meddle with the situation in Chile. That's why APEC summit was cancelled. And I was wondering why we are not mentioned in relation to the developments in Iraq, in Lebanon, and now in Bolivia. Somehow we have not been accused of the coup in Bolivia, and this is strange. So something is happening in the minds of those who normally create geopolitical agenda. I believe that it is very unfortunate what we see in Iraq. It is very unfortunate to see Lebanon in this stage of distress. But don't forget that in Iraq, the people still try to overcome the effect of the American invasion and of the ruthless political engineering which Paul Bremer introduced in Iraq, throwing away all Ba'ath Party members from anywhere. By the way, the best fighters in ISIS are former Saddam Hussein officers who was thrown out of their jobs by Paul Bremer. And you say that there are no mistakes as Winston Churchill said, the Americans always do the right thing after they tried everything else. And in Lebanon, we support the efforts of Saad Hariri to reestablish a government, a caretaker government. But as far as I understand, his idea and the idea of some of his friends is to make this government entirely technocrat, without any political affiliations. I don't believe that this is realistic in the realities of Lebanon.
Thanks very much, Minister. So this is also about bringing the young generation into the conversation. I saw a raised hand by the lady over here. Exactly. The mic is coming to you.
Thank you. I'm Shireen Youssef from BBC Arabic in London. So my question is, I will kind of repeat your question, the first one, but in another way. So Russia play a big role in the Middle East. especially in the conflicts, and supporting whoever seek ally against US. Which in a way can be seen that Russia is actually giving help to whoever serve its interests against USA. Is this how you see what Russia do in Middle East, or you disagree? And if so, why we didn't see Russia, instead of actually helping creating safe zone in Syria and supporting regime that some or there is uprising against it, and you call it legitimate, instead of rebuilding the cities that actually destroyed by airstrikes, Russian airstrikes, and a lot of intervene in Syria.
There should be question mark, as Nora said.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there is a question mark.
Is there one? Okay.
Well, first of all, the regime, as you call it, is the government of a state which is a full member of the United Nations without any restrictions on its rights. So when people say regime, I leave it to your own conscience. Second, never ever we have been designing our foreign policy just to be nasty to the United States. Not at all. If you take the Middle East, Russia is the only country which talks to everybody, be it Syria, where we talk to the government, to the opposition, to the Kurds, and to the Americans, by the way. Our military has a close mechanism on deconflicting. If you take Libya, we talk to Sarraj, we talk to Saleh, we talk to Haftar, we talk to anyone, Gweil and others. The same is true in Iraq. We talk to the Sunni, Shia, to the Kurds. I recently visited Iraq and Baghdad and Erbil. So we always, and of course in Iraq we also work closely with Turkey and Iran. And may I remind you that until Astana Group was formed at in 2016, at the end of 2015, there was no dialogue between the government and the real opposition. The only opposition which was groomed by the West at that time were immigrants living in Istanbul, in Riyadh, in Europe, and the United States. And they were presented as a partner for a dialogue. Then Russia, Turkey, and Iran arranged for the format where the government and those who fight the government with the arms in their hands sat down, and that's how we managed to convene the Congress of the Syrian National Dialogue. That's how we managed to create the Constitutional Committee, and that's how the ceasefire on the vast parts of the Syrian territory was established. So we, actually before that, in 2013, we were very close with the United States on a deal how to resolve the Syrian conflict. And the deal which we struck with John Kerry was about, and which was agreed by the government, that the government Air Force would not fly at all, and that any operations by the US Air Force and by the Russian Air Force would be agreed between us. In other words, US and Russia had a veto on each other's action in Syria. The only condition for this to enter into force was for the United States to separate the armed opposition from terrorists, from Nusra. They never did, and they never managed to do this. And I have reasons to believe, on the basis of real examples over the last years, that the United States still support Nusra, in spite of the fact that this organization has been listed in the United States as terrorist, and they see in Nusra a counterbalance against the government. It's another mistake after they were banking on Mojaheddins, and Mojaheddins organized 9/11. After they did what they did in Iraq and ISIS was born, now they groom Nusra in the expectation, in the illusionary expectation that they would be able to control them. It's an illusion. Speaking of rebuilding the country, we have been promoting projects together with the Syrian government, inviting all others to create conditions to modernize infrastructure for the return of refugees so that the country could get back to the normal life. The United States categorically denies the need for this, and they prohibit to all their allies, NATO, EU, the countries in the region, to invest in any project on the territory controlled by the government. But on the other hand, on the eastern bank of the Euphrates River, they do everything to build quasi-state structures. And they ask the Gulf countries to invest heavily so that they can create local administration based on the Syrian democratic forces, the Kurdish, PYG and others, with very blunt intention to separate this part of Syria and to control the oil fields there. So you please, I believe BBC is a serious outlet. You compare the real facts and don't be guided by slogans.
Let's not be guided by slogans. We have time for one crisp final question. The lady over here.
Sir, Aïché Gulsert, journalist. You just said that the best ISIS fighters are the former Ba'ath Party members. I just returned from the Syrian-Turkish border, where Turkey has launched last month, as you know, with Russia's unofficial or official okay for the Operation Peace Spring. My question is, you mentioned the Kurds in Iraq quite a bit, but what about Kurds in Syria? Thank you.
Знаете, I'm sorry. The Operation Peace Spring was not endorsed by Russia. It was endorsed by the United States. If you are accurate with the facts, they tried to negotiate with Turkey, and then they said, okay, we cannot reach the deal. So Kurds, you're on your own. We are leaving. Then after they left the Kurds and left Syria, they said, okay, we don't have any more obligations in front of the Kurds, but we are coming back for oil, not for the Kurds. It's an interesting zigzagging, you know, in foreign policy, and back to Churchill about the United States always doing it right after they tried everything else. The Kurds in Syria must have a place in the political dialogue, but the Kurds in Syria must be consistent. If they, at the beginning of the conflict, decided that they can go unilateral with the support of the United States, when they declared the creation of this Federation of Rojava, and they thought that they would be always supported by the United States in this separatist movement, this was their decision. We were trying to explain to them and to the government that it is important to start some dialogue between the Damascus authorities and the Kurds. The Kurds were not interested. They believed that they would be always covered by the United States. When the United States made this twist, the Kurds started asking us to help to start a dialogue with the government, which we were ready to do. But then, as the Americans said, we are coming back to control the oil fields, they again lost interest in this dialogue. So we need some consistency. And I have no doubt that at the end of the day, the solution of the Syrian crisis can only be with the interests taken into account of the Kurds and all other ethnic and confessional groups in Syria. The Kurds are represented in the Constitutional Committee in Geneva, but this is not representation of PYG. And you know what the Turks think about PYG, and we believe this issue requires a very thorough discussion and solution which would be strictly political, but which can only be found with all the key players sitting at the same table and thinking in the terms of respecting the territorial integrity of Syria and resolving all national, ethnic, and confessional issues within the territorial integrity of Syria. That's what Constitutional Committee is about.
Minister, famous last words. We talked a lot about the US today, so I wondered, the presidential elections are coming up in 2020, so how is Russia getting ready for that?
We'll resolve the problem, don't worry.
Minister, thank you very much for a very short, very concise, fantastic foreign policy power talk. Thanks so much for being here. And all I can say is I think our founder was true. It's always better to talk with each other rather than about one another. Thanks very much.